Have you ever asked yourself the question, what book of the Bible should I read? Or maybe you are newer to reading the Bible and you're just trying to figure out, man, where do I start? I want to share with you two things that are going to help you select the right book to read. There are 66 books in the Bible, and they can be separated by Old and New Testament. Old Testament refers to Old Contract or Old Covenant or Old Promise. And what that simply means is that this is how God, in beginning of human history, interacted with man. That's the whole essence of the Old Testament. And the New Testament is, hey, this is how God is operating with mankind as it relates to Jesus. Now, Jesus Christ is our sign and post. He is the pillar and post of the Christian faith. It starts and ends with Jesus Christ. And so the Old Testament is how God operated and had relationship with man before Jesus Christ. And the New Testament is how God relates with mankind now that Jesus Christ has been revealed to the world. So, if you were to ask yourself where to start, I would highly recommend starting with the New Testament. The New Testament is full of God's instructions and principles. In fact, the word Bible is an acronym, or you may have heard this, but the word Bible can be taken as an acronym that says basic instructions before leaving earth. Like the idea that when Jesus Christ, before he left the earth, he gave you and I instructions and in principles for us to follow, to lead our lives based off of. And so the New Testament is full of God's instructions and God's principles. And that's a really good place to start. The reason why it's a good place to start is because you don't really need to interpret instructions and principles. They are what they are. Like when God says, love your enemies and pray for those who curse you. There's no wiggle room for interpretation. You don't need a teacher. You don't need a scholar. You don't need Hebrew and Greek to try and figure out what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself. Like you don't, it's just the instruction. It is what it is. I am called to love them and I'm called to pray for them. In other words, there's little wiggle room, for interpretation. And so the New Testament is a great place to start because the New Testament makes things abundantly clear. Now, I do need to address, because there is a thought that exists out there to which I don't believe, that the Old Testament is obsolete and done away with. And nothing is more further than the truth, my friends. The Old Testament is very critical in us developing a holistic picture of who God is. Because if the New Testament provides the instructions and the principles, the Old Testament gives us God's motivation, his heart behind why he gives these instructions and principles. So we understand more of the nature and the likeness of God and God's heart towards us in the Old Testament. And then we learn God's instructions and principles in the New. And so my thought is that you start off with the New so you understand what is expected of us as believers, and then you understand why it's expected of us in the Old Testament. So that's why we go with the New. Another reason why I would recommend starting with the New before the Old, again, is because it's really straightforward. There are instructions and principles, and the Old Testament is more narrative. It's more stories. It's more God intervening in the life of an individual. And sometimes that can be subjective in terms of how you go about interpreting it. And so if you're newer to reading the Bible, you definitely just want to soak up the spirit behind the text. You want to soak up the DNA. You want the Bible to read you first. And then the Old Testament, you can begin to read it. All right. So I highly recommend the New Testament. But then there's so many books in the New Testament. How do I choose the actual book for me? Well, you may have heard people say, hey, if you are just starting out your faith journey, to start in the Gospels, right? So let me just take a step back to kind of then talk about the layout of the New Testament. So the New Testament is also laid out. There's some like layout to it as well. So the first books of the New Testament are called the Gospels. The Gospels just means truth. It means truth. And so the first 4 books are eyewitness accounts. There are records of people who witnessed Jesus, and they recorded it. That's what the Gospels are. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are individuals who committed to following Jesus, observing Jesus, and practicing out the ways of Jesus. And not only that, but recording the acts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they are eyewitnesses and they are watching this transpire. Now, I have to say that just because they're eyewitnesses does not necessarily mean that they're going to report the fact exactly the same, right? Like if you were to cut on the local news and we were to both watch like a natural disaster, my perspective of that natural disaster in Maryland will be very different from the person who's in Florida or in Georgia or North Carolina. It's just two different perspectives of a factual event. That's the Gospels, right? Like there are different perspectives. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're coming from different perspectives about one event, about Jesus Christ. And what I want to do is just kind of give you the lens to which they are writing their Gospels, the lens to which they're writing about this factual event. So Matthew, when he is writing, he's writing to establish the fact that Jesus is king. Because Matthew's paradigm, he is looking at, okay, Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Jesus is an Israelite. And Jewish people, they believe that the Messiah is coming, that there is a king that will come. And so Matthew is writing his book from the vantage point of here is why Jesus is king. Okay. Here is why Jesus is king. So if you have the question, you want to know about the significance of Jesus as it relates to human history, Matthew is a good place to start. But Mark takes on a different approach. Mark takes on the approach of Jesus, the suffering servant. In other words, Mark takes on the approach that Jesus is actually, he has come to serve us, to serve humanity. So Mark takes on that approach that, hey, no, Jesus is serving us. I want you to look at the fact that Jesus is one who comes to add value to your life. And so Mark takes on that approach. So if you ever want to know, okay, what is the benefit of following Jesus? What do I gain from following Jesus? Looking at the book of or reading the book of Mark would be a really great place to really start from. Then you have not only Matthew, Mark, but you have Luke. Now, Luke is an interesting one. Luke, he takes a different approach. He establishes the fact of Jesus's humanity, that Jesus was a actual human being. Like it was a real man named Jesus Christ, and he did real things on the face of the earth. That was Luke's vantage point. And also Luke is a physician. So Luke is very precise. Luke comes in with an investigating mindset. Luke comes into the skeptic's mind. So like if you are maybe skeptical about Jesus, or if maybe you have friends who are skeptical about Jesus and want to know about the humanity of Jesus Christ, like, was this a real man in the face of the earth? Like, was this really the validity of Christ? You want to look to Luke. In fact, I have to read this because it's so good. Luke chapter 1, verses 1-4. Bear with me. It says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. It seems fitting for me as well, having investigated. You see, that word investigated speaks to I'm looking into real facts. So for those, you may be a little bit skeptical, or like, you have lingering questions about Jesus and did he really exist? And, what did he really do? And what was he really like as a human being? Luke is the place to go because he says he investigated everything carefully from the beginning to write it out for you in consecutive order. I love that. So not only is he investigating the factual claim about Jesus Christ, but he's also laying it out in chronological order, like from his birth and after birth. This is what he did, and this is what he did, and you'll see a lot of action words with Luke, right? So in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So again, if you want certainty about your faith, if you want to know the legitimacy about Christ, then you probably want to look to Luke. But John is a little bit different. So Matthew, Mark, So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? These are what we call the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospel literally just mean that it covers the same material. So you'll see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke the exact same events. Jesus walking on water, you'll see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus, being baptized. You'll start to see the same events in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because this is called the synoptic gospel. They're covering the same exact event. But John is a little bit different. John, he is looking at the deity of Jesus. He's looking at this idea that Jesus was not just fully man, like how Luke is talking about, but he was also fully God at the same time. He was fully man 100%, and he was fully God. We call that the God man. Like, that's what John is trying to do. He's trying to establish the deity of Christ. And that's very critical for us if you are in a space where you want to know, like, all right, like, okay, I understand Jesus was human, but like, was he God though? Like, does he have the authority to do some of the things and say some of the things that he's saying? How can I trust some of the things that he's saying? You will see in John over and over again that Jesus was sent from God, and that Jesus, he has a working relationship with God. Another way that I like to see John is that if you have lingering questions about the tangibility of Jesus, the tangibility of God, if you're ever curious, like, what does God look like? Does he have emotions? Does God care about the little mundane things in life? You can look to John, because John speaks to that that Jesus Christ is the very essence, the exact representation of God. In fact, John 1, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. It says, in the beginning, John chapter 1, verse 1, was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. And then it goes on to say, and this word became flesh and dwelt among us. So this idea of the God man, that God is, Jesus is fully man and fully God at the same time. So those are the gospels. So you have the gospels. The New Testament is laid out gospels. Then you have a narrative, which is called Acts. And then you have epistles. Epistles are letters. These are where the instructions and principles come into play. Like the instructions that I was talking to you about a moment ago, about the New Testament is full of instructions and principles. That's where the epistles come into play. These are teachings. These are teachings that were written majority by Paul, that were written to Christians who were in different part of the world. Okay. And so the whole idea was to grow their knowledge of God, not just the experience of Christ, but the knowledge of Christ, to really grow in the knowledge of God. And so I can go into all of the epistles. There are a lot of them, but I want to just keep it focused to, okay, so which book should I be reading now though, Sam? Like, which book should I care most about? Well, I would recommend starting with First John. And the reason why I recommend starting with First John is because First John is a book that shows the entire Christian life, the phases of the Christian faith. It starts off talking about when you first give your life to God, and then it talks about what it looks like to be a mature believer and everything in between. So First John, I highly recommend. But there's some other books that I also recommend that you can first start off with. Another book that I highly recommend is Romans. Romans speaks to what should our convictions and our belief system be? Like, if you want to know as a Christian, like, this is for the individual that are thinkers, that are philosophical in your thinking. Like, I want to know what my tenets and my core beliefs and what should that be as a believer. Highly recommend the book of Romans, because Romans solidifies our convictions. It solidifies our belief by walking us through why Jesus Christ was meant to save us. It walks us through why God wanted salvation to be made possible for us. So it gives us our convictions and our beliefs. So again, I would start off with First John. I would then go to Romans. And then if you are in the faith and you've been in the faith for a while and you're just trying to really get a more disciplined devotional Bible reading, I recommend the book of James. So James, I call it, is a book of maturity. It's about like, as a mature believer, this is how you ought to be. Like, even me, I would go back to James and be convicted, knowing that there's more to my Christianity than what I'm currently experiencing. So James is a book of maturity, and you can connect with that. Well, friends, I hope that this was helpful. Please let me know in the comment section. God bless you. Love you guys.